Hi there, Michael. How are you doing today?
Hi, Laura. Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks very much. Thanks for asking. And welcome everyone to our webinar on FCC and modular approvals and installing radio modules. My name is Laura Llewellyn and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to our technical expert, Michael Darby. Michael is the Technical Director for our Global Connected Technologies division within Element. He has worked as a manufacturer, test engineer and certification body. He is currently the Vice Chair of the TCB Council Board of Directors and is responsible for many technical papers on the topic of radio approvals and integration of radio into other equipment. He provides education and training activities, including webinars and seminar workshops. Before I hand you over to Michael, I just wanted to encourage everyone to submit any questions you have on the GoToWebinar panel to the right-hand side of your screen. And if you do lose connection for any reason, please refresh your browser or re-enter the GoToWebinar platform. Thanks everyone, and with that, I'll now hand you over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Laura. Today's webinar will be a little over 1 hour, maybe about 1 hour, 10 minutes, and then I'll stay on the line to answer any questions that we have. Thank you very much. I'll now share my screen. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my webinar today on radio modules and the integration of radio modules. I'm going to be focusing on the FCC and ISED Canada. So that's the two main North American regions. My name is Michael Darby, Technical Director at Element Materials. This is actually webinar number 2 in a series, so I'm guessing most of you probably attended webinar number 1 last week. And so you will have seen that we are a global network of test labs, consultancies, certification bodies spanning the globe. And I'm happy to be a part of our Connected Technologies division. We provide consultancy and product development services, EMC testing, RF exposure and SAR testing, radio, wireless testing for regulatory and conformance, product safety, and global market access. And that includes the regulatory approvals such as certifications and notified body work. For me personally, I've been in this industry for more than 30 years. I started working for a manufacturer, fixing their products through EMC testing. And then I worked for a commercial test lab for about 16 or 17 years in EMC and radio in the UK and the USA. I spent the last 14 years as a certification body, but also teaching and providing training services such as these webinars. And most of my time these days is trying to help people solve their problems, whether that's in the lab or through a regulatory landscape. Okay, so why am I talking about radio modules on this hot day? Well, it's a wireless world and everybody wants their product radio enabled at this time. When I first started testing, a person would turn up to the lab and say, "Hi, I brought my radio to test," and they would know everything about it. They'd know the antenna, they'd know the power, they'd know exactly how it worked. Whereas nowadays, people manufacture things and they want to be able to radio enable those things, but they may not be a radio manufacturer themselves. So this is a challenge for our industry where historically radio experts don't necessarily work for the same companies who want to put the products on the market. Well, the solution is that we have a group of people who make radio modules, and then we have a group of people who make other products, and they install the radio modules into their products, and you end up with a wireless enabled device. So what is a radio module? What do you picture when I say radio module? Well, maybe you picture something like this. These are all radio modules in this terminology that we speak of in FCC and Canada. You can see that there are a circuit board there with some components on. 2 of them I can see have antenna connectors on, 1 of them doesn't. They all seem to have metal shields on. That's interesting. And some of them have one of them has connectors, and 2 of them seem to have pins for soldering onto a host. How about these? Are these radio products or are these radio modules? Well, we'll go over that in today's webinar. So our goals for today then, we're going to talk about radio module use for North America. So we're going to start off by describing life as seen from the radio module manufacturer's point of view. So what exactly is a radio module? And what does the radio module manufacturer have to go through to get their module tested and authorized as a radio module? And then what does somebody else have to do if they want to take that module and radio enable their own product by installing the module into theirs? Well, who are you then on this call? Well, I guess if you're a radio module manufacturer, then you might well be a radio engineer. You might really know your stuff. You might know exactly how the radio works, the output power, the modulation, the antenna design. That might be you. Or maybe you don't know exactly how it all works, but somehow you seem to get into all the trouble because you're the one that's using the equipment. And your product has the radio in it, and you're on the adventure, and you don't necessarily know how everything works, but it's still very exciting for you. So what are the goals then that we're hoping to achieve with today's webinar? Firstly, we want to understand the requirements. I want to help you avoid some of the most common mistakes. So I said I've been in this industry for more than 30 years, and my webinars and seminars are always based on the most common mistakes that I see people making on a daily basis. Speed up your time to market, which is absolutely critical. Most people want to save time by reducing their testing or reducing their certification, but really, if they could step back and look at the whole project, they'd realize that the maximum amount of profit comes from getting the product on the market as quickly as possible. Increase product quality. So if you're starting to integrate radio products into other products, and the two companies who make those two components are not the same ones, then there's a potential for interference between the equipment. Reducing risks, whether it's to non-compliance or with regard to market surveillance, and understanding your legal responsibilities, whether you're a module manufacturer or you're installing a module. One of the most critical things that I like to talk about, especially on this topic of radio modules, is the difference between testing and approvals. Now, you will have seen this slide on my webinar last week. A lot of people seem to think of testing and approvals as one thing, one common thing. You want to get your product tested so that it's approved, or get my product approved so that I know it passes. It's really not that simple. Testing and approvals are two different things. You could test a product so that it passes, but it might not be correctly approved. You could have products that appear to be approved, but you may still need to do some testing even after the approvals are complete. Now, last week's webinar, we talked about incorrect testing and how the incorrect test procedure or test method could invalidate your approvals. And in today's webinar, it's more about whether the testing needs to be repeated on the final product, or whether the test results are only applicable for a radio module. So as I said, this is part 2 of a 4-part webinar series. So hopefully you saw last week's. If not, it's available on demand. If you like, you can re-watch it or watch it for the first time. All of these 4 webinars will be recorded. And so if you're coming in midway through, it is possible to go back and watch from the beginning. So what did we learn last week? Well, we talked about the FCC and ISED compliance in general. We talked about the 2 authorization routes, supplier's declaration of conformity and certification, and we explained what they are. We talked about how multiple authorizations apply for one piece of equipment. So for example, the laptop in front of me here, it has a certification authorization for its Wi-Fi. It has a certification authorization for its Bluetooth, and it has an SDOC authorization for the fact that it's a digital device laptop. So it's a fully compliant product, and I could say that this one product has all its complete FCC compliance and ISED Canada compliance, but it has 3 authorization procedures associated with it based on the fact that it has 2 transmitters and 1 sort of operation as an electronics device. And that's without me even looking to see if the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth is achieved through a radio module or through designing into itself. We talked about the testing requirements for authorization. what happens if you change the equipment, and we explained what a permissive change is. We talked about applications to the TCB for a certification, and we talked about maintaining compliance once the product's on the market. So hopefully you've got a pretty good grasp of all those things, either because you watched last week's webinar or because you chose not to because you already know these topics. Okay, so let's have a look at the agenda for today then. So we're going to start off with the FCC and ISED's radio module rules, testing and certification of a radio module. We're going to talk about what the module actually gives you. When you've got a certified radio module, what does that actually mean to somebody who buys it? What does it give you, for example? And then what are the testing and technical responsibilities for somebody installing a certified module into their product? And what are the finally, what are the legal and paperwork or admin responsibilities, the authorization responsibilities for a company installing a radio module into their product? And finally, hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Certainly I'll stay on the line long enough to answer all the questions that come in. Okay, so today we're going to go over the USA and Canada. Now, as a quick reminder, for the FCC authorization, transmitters require a certification. There are a few exceptions, but really when we're talking about radio modules, we're talking about transmitters that require certification. The most common types of radio module are Wi-Fi or wireless LAN, Bluetooth, Zigbee, cellular, such as LTE, NB-IoT, 5G, and RFID, things like that. All of those require certification. Certification, remember, is a form of registration with the FCC and ISED. So if a product is certified, it doesn't just mean I passed some tests. Of course, there is the passing of tests, and that's very important, but it also means that somebody has uploaded the details of the transmitter to the FCC and to ISED Canada. And that's very important for today's webinar. So the module manufacturer will have certified the module and supplied all the technical information of the transmitter to the FCC and ISED. Radios would have FCC and FCC IDs and ISED certification numbers when they are certified with the FCC in Canada. That applies to any type of transmitter or equipment. Host equipment is also authorized, as I just said, with my laptop. And as I said, each part is authorized separately. Even though you have a fully compliant end product, it could have multiple authorizations associated with it. Okay, so a quick reminder then of the assessment scope, and this is an important thing for the topic of modules. RF exposure safety is within the scope of the FCC. Product safety is not, and I said Canada. EMC performance of the host product, EMC emissions, that is, and the radio performance of the transmitter. So really, the FCC and ISED Canada are interested in what's coming off of the product, whether it's the RF exposure to the human body, the out-of-band spurious emissions to the environment or to the radio spectrum, or the transmitter performance to the band that the radio is operating in. So the main types of equipment we talked about for the USA and Canada, we have unintentional radiators. In the topic of radio modules, that's most likely going to be the host product. IT equipment, receivers, things like that. And then we have intentional radiators. So these are transmitters and generally categorized into two groups: unlicensed transmitters, such as in FCC Part 15, and licensed transmitters. So the good examples would be Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are unlicensed, and cellular, LTE, 3G, 5G would all be licensed. The SDOC procedure, you perform the required tests to the correct standard, compile and keep your technical data, and label with the FCC statements. And this is important on the topic of radio modules, because often the host product that the module goes into is authorized through an SDOC. So just because you've got a module installed, this SDOC still needs to be performed on the host. You remember last week we talked about the fact that there is no such thing as like a primary function or a single definition of a product. If it's a host product with a transmitter in it, it doesn't detract from the fact that it has a host product authorization. Meanwhile, certification, you perform the required tests in the correct test lab, compile the technical data, submit all the information to the TCB, and receive the FCC grant and the ISED certificate. Multiple authorizations then to one product is an important thing to keep in mind on this topic of radio modules. Okay, so let's move now to the topic of radio module approvals. We're going to talk about the requirements for modular approval as viewed by a module manufacturer, first of all, and what the module approval means. Now, firstly, on those original slides with the pictures on, there was that one slide that showed 3 little radio modules. And then there was a second slide that showed kind of typical radio equipment, like a wireless LAN access point. There's a couple of USB dongles on there, but let's think more about the wireless LAN access point or some other piece of radio equipment. If you take a piece of radio equipment and you certify it to the FCC and ISED rules, and then you permanently install it inside some other equipment, the certification is effectively lost because you've modified that product beyond recognition. It doesn't look the same, it isn't the same product, it's been installed inside some host, and so the certification isn't valid anymore. You'd need to get a certification of the end product. The exception to that is if the radio has a modular approval. Now, modular approval is a type of certification, and it gives the radio superpowers such that it can remain certified even when it's installed inside something else. Now, the FCC and FCC rules and ISED standards came along and were around for a long time before modular approvals were invented. And modular approvals came about for the idea where originally a person would make, design and build a radio product. And it became obvious that people wanted to make these modules and then install thousands of versions of an identical module into thousands of different products. And effectively, you'd end up recertifying lots of different devices, all based on the same transmitter. And modular approval is a way for the certification of the radio module to remain valid even when it's installed inside a host. The FCC ID and the ISED number of the module is kept with the module. So the radio module itself is certified. The module has the FCC ID and the module has the ISED certification number. The purpose was to reduce the certification effort and the duplication of certifications, because every certification is listed on the FCC's website and originally involved some form of processing by the FCC. For many years, there was a kind of myth that if you took a radio module and installed it inside a host, there was no need for any additional testing on the final equipment. But that really isn't the case, as you will see here today. And so modular approval is for a radio to be used inside other equipment. You wouldn't get radio module approval on a radio that isn't intended to be installed into something else. So there are 2 main types of modular approval. Firstly, there's full modular approval. And this is a case where a module manufacturer makes a radio module, but they don't know which host it's going to be installed into. They make the module and they plan to just sell lots of them to a whole range of installers, a whole range of users for a whole range of applications. They don't know which product it's going to go into. So they want full modular approval on the module. There's also a type of certification called limited modular approval. And this is where a module can't quite meet the requirements for full modular approval. So there's something about the module which isn't good enough to be installed into any host, but the module manufacturer knows which host it is going to be installed into. And so you could have a certain module certified for a range of hosts or a range of environments, or for some specific use case that can be controlled by the module manufacturer. And in both cases, regardless whether it's full modular approval or limited modular approval, it's still the module which is certified. And the module has the FCC ID and the IC number. And the module has to be labeled, so the module will have it written on there. Okay, so let's focus. All of the slides, as much as possible through my presentation today, are generic for the FCC and ISED. And as much as possible, I've tried to have a common set of slides. But there are a couple of occasions where the requirements deviate. So there are some criteria for becoming modular approval. And between the FCC and ISED, they are very, very similar. But I'm writing the list for the FCC here. Modular approvals for the USA, for FCC, are listed in 15.212 of the FCC rules. Now, the observant ones amongst you will notice that that is in part 15 of the rules. So modular approvals is only actually written for unlicensed transmitters in the FCC rules. But the FCC do allow licensed modules to be certified, and they allow that by referencing them in a modular approval KDB, and stating that if the licensed modules can meet all the requirements of the Part 15 unlicensed modules, then you could have a certified licensed radio module. So that there isn't a specific section for licensed radio modules, but they are incorporated through the KDB. Okay, so these 8 criteria. So if you're a module manufacturer, this is what your module must have. It must have a shield over the transmitter section. The purpose of this was to reduce the amount of interference from the module into the host, but also reduce the amount of interference from the host into the module, so that you could install the module into the host and have confidence that the host wouldn't cause the module to perform badly, and that signals from the module should not couple across onto the host. Must have buffered data or modulation inputs. A lot of products have digital inputs these days, but imagine a FM or AM transmitter such that the module manufacturer tests it with a certain level of deviation, and then the installation is able to drive it harder. Well, in the digital world, I guess you could say that the person, the installer, could somehow use the module in a way that the module manufacturer hadn't considered. But basically, the data inputs must be controlled within the module. The module must have a power supply regulation, and that's so that regardless of what host you plug it into, the final transmitter section will always see the same voltage. The module must meet the Part 15 antenna requirements. Now, you may remember from last week that Part 15 or unlicensed transmitters are certified with their antenna, tested with the antenna, and the antenna is listed with the radio equipment. And that applies here to radio modules. The radio module must be tested in a standalone configuration. So that's just tested on a bench on its own, not in a host. The ideal condition would be on the end of a long piece of ribbon cable, at least 10 centimeters long. But most of the time, modules are tested on a test jig. If you can demonstrate that the test jig doesn't cause any interference, for example, if there are no components on the underside of the module, maybe only a ground plane, then you could use that as justification for using the test jig, and that's acceptable. The module must be labeled with the FCC ID, or the IC number for Canada. It must meet its own FCC rule part. So, for example, you're busy following the modular approvals route on your Bluetooth module, and that's just a reminder, well, it's also got to meet the Bluetooth requirements. And it must meet the RF exposure requirements. All radio modules must be assessed for RF exposure. So over the years, I've heard many people say, look, my module hasn't got a shield, but I think it's okay because we did the spurious emissions test and it passed. So if it passes without a shield, well, it would really, really pass with a shield. Or I know the rules say you've got to test it standalone, but it only operates when it's in a host. We can't get it to work on its own. So we tested it in a host. Or, well, okay, our module doesn't have a voltage regulator, but we found that most hosts use 5-volt input. So we tested at 5-volt and we're pretty sure that would be okay. In all of those in all of those cases, you could not have full modular approval on a module if it didn't have a shield, or if it didn't have, or if it was tested in a host, or it didn't have a regulator. It would have to be limited modular approval, specifically for the host it was tested in, or hosts that provide their input voltage, or retested in every host if it didn't have a shield. I could answer as an engineer or as a lawyer. You know, as an engineer, I could say, well, there are signals that could couple across from the host, or, well, not every host has exactly 5 volts. Or I could simply answer as a lawyer or as a TCB and say, look, I'm sorry, it's in the rules, and that's that. So, excuse me, this application for certification by the module manufacturer must come with a cover letter to describe those 8 criteria and to explain how the radio module meets those 8 criteria. If you have a limited modular approval, it is assessed with or in the host. Ideally, it would be tested in the host it's going to be tested in, but it is possible to simulate that. So, for example, it could be tested with a typical 5 volts supply, and then limited only to hosts that use identical 5-volt supplies, for example. But ideally, if it's got a limited modular approval, then the module manufacturer knows which hosts it's going to go into, and it would be assessed for use in those hosts with that host. In the case of limited modular approval, the module's certification file would list the hosts, or all of the hosts, or the conditions under which the module could be used. Because remember, if you want to say this module can be used in any host, then you really need to meet those 8 criteria and get full modular approval. If you don't meet one of them, and you've gone for limited modular approval, then there must be some limitation and you must know about it. The installation guide should clearly state what the limitations and what the hosts are, and there are clear rules that the module installation instructions must contain a lot of detail. And that final bullet point there applies to limited modular approvals, but also to full modular approvals. The installation instructions are very important, and I'll come on to that in another slide. So full modular approval then, the module is tested fully to the applicable FCC rule part and RSS. So for example, if it's Bluetooth, it would be fully tested to 15.247 and RSS 247 to meet the FCC and ISED rules. And in addition, the modular approvals rules in 15.212 and Canada's RSP 100. So if it's only tested to the rule part that applies to the transmitter and certified, then it's going to be certified as a radio. If it's tested to the FCC rule part and RSS standard and it meets the modular approvals requirements, then it can have certification as a radio module. And the FCC ID and the ISED number again relates to the module. The certification is optional for radio modules in the USA and Canada. So that means if you're a manufacturer of radio modules, you can choose whether you want to certify your modules and sell them as pre-certified modules, or just sell them as uncertified modules for use in any host. And as an installer, you've got the choice. You could pay a little bit more and buy a certified module, or probably pay a little bit less and buy a module which has not been certified. That's unlike other regions like the EU, for example. Okay, so I mentioned the installation instructions. The radio module's installation instructions should be clear and complete. Now, you remember last week when we talked about certifying a radio transmitter, and we listed the things a manufacturer must provide to the TCB. We talked about all the test reports, cover letters, technical documents such as schematics, parts lists, data sheets, and the identification such as external photographs, internal photographs, and user manual. Well, with a radio module, you're getting the certification, all of those things need to be provided and they're just as important, but really, really critical is the installation instruction from the module manufacturer. Because of course, very simply, it's going to be installed into something else. The antenna type and antenna path must be detailed in the installation instructions. I've written including trace there. You may remember that slide with the pictures of the modules. Two of them had antenna ports on, antenna connectors, but one of them didn't. Basically on that one of the solder on pins on the bottom of the module would have been the RF path. And then there would be a trace, a PCB trace on the host, such that the host product contains the radio module. Contains the antenna. In such a case, the module manufacturer, of course, has to test with the antenna. So the module manufacturer will have created a test jig antenna trace, and they will have to exactly describe how that looked to the installer, so that when the installer puts the module into their host, they can perfectly replicate the antenna trace layout that the module manufacturer used. And if the installer wants to deviate from that, it's effectively a new antenna type. The RF exposure conditions must be in the installation instructions. For example, whether it can be held next to the body as a portable product or must be more than 20 centimeters away as a mobile product or fixed. The legal and technical responsibilities for testing the host product. As you'll learn in today's webinar, if you install a certified module into your host product, there are some testing requirements. There's the original SDOC testing that you were always expecting to do on your host, but there's two additional things. Firstly, the installation of the radio module probably changes the SDOC testing you were planning to do. And secondly, there's the transmitter performance testing that has been done on the module, but has to be done again on your final product. Now, the installation instructions should make that clear to the installer, but they don't always do a good job of doing that. And of course, the compliance effects of installing a module. So instructing the installer as to whether there is any additional changes to the certification, such as a permissive change, and when that might be needed. So a lot of manufacturers of radio modules are supplying basically the technical instructions of how to connect the module and how to get the radio working. And the FCC and ISED Canada have commented a few times lately that the regulatory instructions are missing. RF exposure. Well, we talked about RF exposure last week and the difference between mobile and portable devices. Mobile is a device which is more than 20 centimeters from the body, and portable is used within 20 centimeters of the body in normal use. Most modules are certified as mobile. It is possible to certify as portable if the power is low. Now, why might that be the case that people will certify modules as mobile? Well, you may recall that there's a power threshold. So every transmitter gets assessed to a power threshold. If the power is below the threshold, then an RF exposure test is not necessary. And if the power is above the threshold, then the RF exposure test or detailed calculation becomes necessary. So if we're talking about portable devices then that are worn on the body, if the power is below the threshold, then we say, right, you can carry or wear this transmitter next to the body without any requirements for a SAR test. But if the power is above the threshold, then the portable device must have a SAR test. Well, SAR testing would be performed at the level of the final radio equipment, because that's where the final antenna configuration is and the host layout is. So if the output power of the module is low enough, such as a 1 milliwatt Bluetooth, for example, then you could certify it for mobile or portable, because the power would be low enough it doesn't matter. But if the power is a bit higher, such as a wireless LAN or an LTE module, then often the portable use, the output power would be too high to avoid testing, and it would be high enough that a SAR test would be needed. And in which case, the module manufacturer can't easily do that. So they would instead certify their modules for mobile use. Now, it is possible to do a SAR test on the radio module, and if the SAR results from the radio module are low enough, then it can be justified that the end product doesn't require a SAR test. But actually, this isn't done very often because the antenna must be identical and the SAR result must be very low. You would have noticed that the FCC grant notes on radio modules appear to limit things and appear to make things quite difficult. Some maybe lazy wording by some TCBs. They say things like co-location with other transmitters must not be done, or must not be co-located with other transmitters. Well, must not be is a pretty strong term, and it kind of sounds like it's the end of the road. There's nothing you can do. What it actually means is the radio module was assessed standalone, as of course it's meant to be. And the radio module did not assess it for use next to other transmitters, because how could they? They didn't know where it was going to end up or what other transmitters were going to be there. So it really means the module manufacturer did not assess it for co-location with other transmitters, which is really just an instruction to the installer. Okay, you've got some work to do now because you have to consider the co-location. Another grant note would be must be more than 20 centimeters from a person. This is a very common statement on grants, but really it just means that the module manufacturer assessed it for mobile use. So that actually is quite correct, that you must use it for mobile use. But again, it's not impossible to change that. As we'll see in a later slide, you can use a permissive change in a lot of cases to transfer the module certification from mobile to portable. Okay, so the certification of the module, remember, there's a legal reference to the module. If you were to go to the FCC or ISED website and type in the FCC ID or ISED number, you would come up with the details of the radio module. Even when the module is installed in a host, it's the module itself that the FCC and ISED have the details of. Does not guarantee that the module is going to pass when it's installed in every host. It does show that the module passed when it was tested standalone, and it does show that the details of the transmitter have been reviewed by a TCB and uploaded to the FCC and ISED. The installer may not need to recertify the transmitter when they've installed it because the module manufacturer has already done that effort for them. So the module was tested standalone and certified, such that when you install it, you should not have to certify the transmitter. There are some useful KDBs on this topic. The most important one is KDB 996369, and then also the labeling, RF exposure, and SAR on laptops KDBs are often used by people in the module world. So let's go back to our pictures then. Do we think these are radio modules? Well, they look like they've either got an antenna connector or an RF pin. They look like everything's contained within them. They certainly look like they've got a shield over their transmitter section. Yeah, they qualify as radio modules, and so those could be tested and certified as radio modules. These ones then, well, the bottom two, those are Wi-Fi routers. Very, very unlikely that they would be certified as radio modules because they're not for installation into other things. They probably haven't got a big shield over their transmitter section. You know, these are end products. Again, with the USB dongles, that's an interesting thing. They are probably not certified as radio modules. They are probably certified as end products. But interestingly, if you took a USB dongle and if it was certified as a transmitter and authorized as a computer peripheral, you are able to install it and reference it as if it was a certified module. Okay, so let's take our radio module now and put it into something else. So we're going to install our module into a host product. In theory, and hopefully, there's no need to certify the host because the FCC and Canada have already got all the schematics and the parts lists and the circuit diagrams. So those details of the transmitter should not need to be uploaded to the FCC. The module manufacturer did all that for you. You cannot certify the host based on the module. If you want to get certification of a host, if you want to install a certified module into the host, you can't just say, I'd like my own certification on the host based on the fact that it contains a certified module. Instead, you can get certification on the host and you can forget that the module was certified, but you're going to have to do a lot more testing and you're going to have to provide all those technical documents to the FCC through the TCB and Canada. Okay, so the label on the host doesn't have its own FCC ID because you're referring to the certification of the module. So the label of the host product states contains FCC ID or contains IC, and it references the number, the certification number, the FCC ID of the radio module. So the host product would state contains FCC ID and then contains IC. And if you were to go online and type in those FCC ID and ISED numbers, you'd end up with the details of the module, not of the host. The installer must follow those module grant statements. So for example, if it's a very low power transmitter, like a 1 milliwatt Bluetooth device, then hopefully the grant would say certified for mobile or portable use. And so you could install it, check that you don't need to do any form of SAR testing, and you're good to go. But if the grant says for mobile use only, then you must use it in a mobile device. And if you want to put it in a portable device, then you know you've got some serious work to do, and you probably need to get in touch with the module manufacturer. It's quite a lazy thing that happens, and I don't know if it's laziness or ignorance. I often see certification bodies often just by default write certified for mobile use at more than 20 centimeters. And manufacturers just seem to think, well, I just need to provide a statement which shows, or a calculation which shows that it's safe at 20 centimeters, which is fine for mobile use. But if the module is below the SAR test power threshold, then you should also provide a calculation to show how it's compliant at portable use. If you had a really low power, 0.5 milliwatt Bluetooth transmitter or 0.5 milliwatt RFID, and you had it certified as a radio module, and you didn't think about that at the certification of the module stage, and you had mobile use only, even though it would be perfectly safe to use it as portable, you couldn't do so until the grant had been updated. And again, if you're installing a radio module and you look at the FCC grant of the module, as hopefully you would, if you notice it says limited modular approval, then you better make sure that your product is one of the hosts that it's limited for. So the host product must also comply with its own requirements. So I said that the host has to have its own authorization. So my laptop here, for example, would have its own SDOC or certification as a digital device. It would have had its own emissions performed, and maybe it had some other transmitter in it. So I said that my laptop here has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Now let's say, for example, my Wi-Fi comes from a certified radio module, but let's say my Bluetooth was designed in and built in by my laptop manufacturer. So my laptop would have an SDOC or certification for its digital device. It would have a certification for its Bluetooth, and then it would also reference the FCC ID of the radio module. So if the host is just a digital device, that needs authorizing, and if the host has its own transmitters built into it, then the host might also need a certification in addition to the radio module being installed. And the radio module is now part of those host tests. What do I mean by that? Well, you may remember this slide from last week where it says what frequency you do your spurious emissions tests up to, your Part 15B digital device spurious emissions. If your product had a clock processor of 200 megahertz, you would have been doing your spurious emissions up to 2 gigahertz. Well, if you've now installed a Bluetooth radio module, then the module contributes to this calculation. So your module would have a 2.4 gigahertz signal in it. So when you're doing your Part 15B unintentional radiator emissions, you would suddenly have to start testing up to 12.5 gigahertz. So the final radio equipment must be compliant. It must meet all of the requirements, and it is the end manufacturer's responsibility. Now, the radio module manufacturer does remain legally responsible for the transmitter module that they're selling. So the module manufacturer, they are the certifier of that module, and they remain responsible for the compliance of their modules in every host. So they can't just certify it and sit back and relax. They got to take every measure to make sure the module will remain compliant when it's in the host. So the module manufacturer is responsible, but the installer is also responsible. And there are many examples where a certified radio module is installed inside a host, and all the approvals appear to be perfectly in place, but the thing fails. So the module is tested and certified. It has its own modular approval. The host has been tested and authorized. But then when you go and use it, the transmitter module inside the host, the combination of the transmitter and the host fails the tests. And we've seen examples of these from the most complicated computers all the way down to a very simple light bulb in a silver dish. The host must comply with all of the requirements. The final product must meet the EMC and radio limits. This was a clarification back in 2016 where the myth of install a radio module and you don't need to test was finally busted. Now, it may not mean that you need to do full retesting. So if you're sitting there now thinking, well, okay, so if I buy a fully certified radio module and then I install it into my host, is he telling me I've got to repeat all of those radio tests? I'm not saying that, actually. So if we use an example of a Bluetooth will have transmitter output power, transmitter spurious emissions, and other tests such as how long it spends on each channel and how many channels it hops over, and is the hopping rate pseudo-random? Well, when you install that module into your host, you can easily have affected the transmitted output power, and you can definitely have affected the transmitter spurious emissions. But it's very unlikely, unless you've done something strange to the firmware, it's very unlikely that you will have changed the Bluetooth hopping rate or the hopping sequence or how long it's spending on each channel. So you could easily justify to yourself that some of those protocol tests don't need testing on your final product, but that your transmitter power and spurious emissions probably do. Again, you've got the test report and photographs of how the module was tested, all available online. So when you're installing the radio module into your host product, you can go onto the FCC's website, you can call up the radio modules test report and the test photograph, so you can see how it was tested, what kind of jig it was on, and how much it passed by. And that could influence your decision on how much testing you do on your final radio product. The host must comply with all of the requirements. The transmitter must still pass its tests. Transmitter spurious emissions is the most common test that people would check, but also the transmitter output power. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do every modulation mode on bottom, middle, and top channels. If you've looked at the modules test report and you've figured out which mode was the worst case and you figured out which channel was the worst case, then you could probably start with testing that one. I said on the early slides that time to market is probably the most critical thing, and this is where I see a split in approach by installers. Some installers are really happy to sit and take their time and maybe look over the modules test reports and say, right, I've examined it, I've decided that this modulation was the worst and this channel was the worst. Please start by testing that mode and that channel in the host, and then come and tell me what the results are like. And then you look at the results and go, do you know what, that looks good, we'll stop testing there. Or no, that looks bad, let's keep testing. That way, you'll probably do the minimum amount of testing necessary. But you need somebody who's going to look at the test reports. You need a lab that you can go into and out of and into again. Other manufacturers will just say, look, we haven't got that, we haven't got time for that, just install the module, test it, and get it done. We've got one slot in the lab, just test it all. Different approaches by different manufacturers. So those final tests, there is not one definitive list of tests. If you look in the FCC rules on what tests must I do when I install a radio module, you won't find it. There's guidance in the KDB 996369 where it certainly says, you know, spurious emissions, EIRP, but it never says you must test those things, and it never says you don't need to test more. It's the manufacturer must take ownership and responsibility. Now, the test lab can advise and recommend, and so as a test lab and TCB, we would say, right, you certainly need to check your transmitter spurious emissions. Now, if you as the manufacturer choose not to do that, then it's your decision. And if you as the manufacturer decide that more testing is necessary, then that's also your decision. The testing performed of the host product to verify that the transmitter spurious emissions are okay do not need to be submitted to the TCB. This is just for the manufacturer's own benefit. Even if the host product is getting authorized through certification, that host product digital device certification, you would provide the unintentional radiator emissions to the TCB, but your own checks to confirm that the transmitter is okay is test results that you need to keep for yourself. And so therefore, people would only check on it if the product is found to be non-compliant. If you've got multiple radios in a device, then that's something to think about, and it increases the chances of that when you're using radio modules. So maybe you've installed multiple modules, maybe you've installed one module into a device that already had a transmitter. Remember that the FCC rules state that all transmitters must be enabled during the testing, if indeed that they can be on whilst they're in normal mode. The end product must meet the output power limits per band. So this is interesting. So let's say, for example, you've got a 2.4 gig Wi-Fi. The module manufacturer tests the power, it meets the limit. You've got a Bluetooth module. The module manufacturer of that module tests the power, it complies. And then you've got a 2.4 gigahertz Zigbee. The manufacturer of that tests the power, that complies. Now an installer puts all three of them into a host product and they can all three transmit at the same time. Well, the output power of that product must not exceed the output power limit for that frequency band. So you're going to need to start adding the powers of the modules that you've integrated. And of course, very importantly, the combined RF exposure from all of those transmitters must be considered. And if it's a mobile device for more than 20 centimeters from the user, then you're looking at the combined field strength or power density in the air levels. And if you've got a portable device, then you're going to need to consider whether the end product needs a SAR test. So EMC emissions must be performed. The transmitter performance must be checked. It does not necessarily mean that you need to retest everything, but you need to have confidence that it will comply. And you also have to check that the RF exposure conditions of your end product are okay. So let's have a look at the EMC emissions. Well, the EMC is assessed at the final radio equipment level. Of course, you'll do EMC emissions, but you've got to consider the module's frequency when you're calculating what frequency to test up to. Transmitter performance, radiated test cases would be assessed at the final equipment level. So transmitter spurious emissions, maybe the EIRP, but maybe the installer might choose not to retest any of those other test cases, especially on a cellular device where you might have a lot of testing, or Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. RF exposure. Well, if the module was assessed for mobile at more than 20 centimeters and the host is also mobile at more than 20 centimeters, then you could probably just take the same calculations that the module manufacturer used and consider that appropriate for your product. If your product is portable and exceeds the SAR test threshold, then you're going to need to do a SAR test. The installer may need to work with the module's manufacturer, and they may need to ask the module manufacturer to do a permissive change on the module. Remember that the certification is on the module, so the installer can't do a permissive change, not even a class 1. The module, we talked last week about rebranding and the FCC change in ID or ISED multiple listing. So the FCC and ISED do encourage this with modules where the installer could do a change in ID and multiple listing to put their own FCC ID and IC number onto the module. It's not mandatory, but it's an option. It would mean that the installer takes legal responsibility of the module and could make more changes without having to keep going back and contacting the module manufacturer all the time. For example, if a new antenna type or antenna trace path layout is used, it must be a class 2 permissive change. If the RF pin on a solder down module is there, then the path is considered a type. Again, the installation instructions should be clear on the antenna type and the antenna path layout. Only the module grantee can decide if it's the same. So if you've bought a radio module with an RF pin and you've followed carefully the instructions on how the antenna trace layout should look, but then you think, well, I've deviated from it a little bit. The installer can't decide, is my deviation constituting a new type or not. You have to go to the module manufacturer and ask them. Only they legally can make that decision. The FCC do not appreciate installers asking them what to do when I buy a new radio module, because the installation instructions should be very clear on that. So as I mentioned before, RF exposure, most modules are certified as mobile. It is possible to certify as portable, and it is possible to do a SAR test on the module, but very, very unlikely. If there are new RF exposure conditions, then going from mobile module into a portable host requires at least a class 2 permissive change, because you need to change the grant conditions to state that it can be used in portable cases. If you have a mobile module and you're putting it into a mobile host, that does not require a class 2 permissive change. Even if you're combining multiple mobile modules, you can do that as a calculation as the installer and consider that your own calculation. Ideally, you would let the module manufacturer know for their Class 1 permissive change information. Mobile or portable, they are categories of authorization. So if you've got multiple modules or transmitters changing the RF exposure conditions, so if you've got 3 mobile modules and you want to put them all into a portable host, you need to do a Class 2 permissive change on at least one of them. In the past, you had to do Class 2 permissive changes on all 3 of them, but nowadays you can do a Class 2 permissive change on one of them, typically the highest power one, and then consider that all 3 are covered in that Class 2 permissive change. Only the module grantee can change the RF exposure condition. Often the installer handles it or acts as an agent and does all the admin and paperwork, but the module manufacturer must be the one who legally takes responsibility for converting a module from mobile to portable. Unless, of course, the installer does a change in ID and multiple listing to put their own FCC ID and ISED number onto the module, then the installer can do their own Class 2 permissive change and Class 4 permissive change for Canada to go from mobile to portable. Even if there's no testing necessary, even if you buy in a module that's 0.5 milliwatt, but for some reason the grant states mobile use only, it still requires a Class 2 permissive change to convert it to portable. So if you've got a mobile module and you put it into a portable host, it must have a Class 2 permissive change to change the module's certification category. There is an exemption or a variation to this. If you've got a mobile module that's sort of higher power and you put it into a small portable host, like a wearable device, like a cell phone, then such that a SAR test is needed, then it can be that Class 2 permissive change isn't enough and product certification is needed. So if you go from a mobile module into a portable host, and let's say you've got a big product, but it's got a carry strap so you can carry it around. So it's a portable device. You need to consider the portable use because it's got a big carrying strap. But the RF exposure SAR test could be enough to qualify for a Class 2 permissive change. But if you've got a small portable device like a mobile phone or a watch or a tablet, then the construction of that end product is really affecting the SAR test. Really, the module is gone at this point and it's fully integrated into the host, and the whole SAR results are dependent on that host. And at that point, the FCC and ISED Canada want to see final product certification, not a Class 2 permissive change. ISED Canada have made it pretty clear, actually. They've said that if the SAR results are over a certain level and the host product is more than 20 centimeters, the host product is less than 20 centimeters dimension, then it must have a final product certification. So my mobile phone, for example, is less than 15 centimeters. So if you were to put a module into that, it would need a product certification. I couldn't have contains FCC ID on that. The FCC are a little bit more vague. They don't state a 20 centimeter size. They just state that small portable devices with a SAR test must have end product certification. So if you want to avoid that, and if you like to try and use Class 2 permissive change, you'd need to contact them with a Class 2 permissive change. So if you've made changes, you install the module. If you change the antenna or the antenna path or the RF exposure conditions, you have to do a test or an assessment or an evaluation. Maybe you do a change in ID and multiple listing, and ultimately it's going to be either a Class 2 permissive change by the module manufacturer or a full product certification by the installer. If you've got multiple modules or multiple radios into one device, this really does affect the testing that the installer has to do, because remember, the module manufacturer was unable to do that. The rules state that spurious emissions are performed whilst all transmitters are transmitting. Well, of course, the module manufacturer couldn't do that, if you didn't know what other transmitters your host was going to contain. So the final product must have a full compliance to it. The FCC and ISED are really looking for a holistic compliance solution such that the end manufacturer or the installer is taking full responsibility for the product they place on the market. As I said, I've put this slide up before and I'm putting it up again. The installation instructions should be very clear. It says installation instructions should be very clear. The antenna type and path should be defined. The RF exposure conditions should be defined. The legal responsibilities for testing in the host should be explained, and the compliance effects. For example, if you put it into a portable device, it invalidates the certification, that kind of thing. Now, finally, everyone likes to know what they should do, but everybody also wants to know what happens if it goes wrong. If market surveillance finds a non-compliant product on the market, well, if they find a non-compliant radio module on the market, so the module is for sale, they do surveillance on the module and it fails, well, of course, the market surveillance is just going to go and talk to the module manufacturer. But what if they find a final radio product and it states contains FCC ID, so it's got a certified radio module in it, market surveillance finds that, tests it, and it's non-compliant? Well, firstly, they're going to investigate it. So you've got a module in a final product, spurious emissions fail. If you take the module out and the module on its own passes, but fails when it's installed in the host, then the module manufacturer has done nothing wrong there, and it's the installer who has failed there, and they are the ones in trouble. If you take the module out and it fails on its own, perhaps through poor quality control by the module manufacturer, such that the host on its own passes, the module fails, and then when you install the module in the host, the end product fails, well, of course, the module manufacturer is in trouble then. But also the end product manufacturer is also in trouble for not noticing that. So in both cases, the end product manufacturer needs to make sure the product they sell is compliant. Okay, so let's go back to this slide, my testing versus approvals slide. You can see then that testing is very, very important, but it's not the whole thing. You can test a module, but it needs to be approved correctly if you want modular approval on it. Similarly, you could have an FCC certified or Canada certified module and put it into a correctly approved host, and approvals all seem to be correct, but they could fail a test because nobody's done that yet. So you can see that testing and approvals are very important, but they're not exactly the same thing. So finally then, I would say that authorized radio modules are a great thing, and it's a great industry. If we didn't have them, manufacturers would still be trying to design in, you've got some great, wonderful piece of multimedia equipment, and everybody be trying to hire a small number of radio engineers to radio enable their products. Whereas instead, the module industry allows all of these types of radios to become radio enabled without each manufacturer having radio engineers. The final product must pass the test, sure, but that's hopefully not too much of a headache, and the final company takes the responsibility, but hopefully most of the testing and certification has been already done by the module manufacturer. Interestingly, of course, the results from the module can be just as important as the certification. So some common mistakes, well, consistency of information. The module must be tested and certified, and then the information for the end product must be correct and relating to the end one. So if you wanted to do a class 2 permissive change on a product that includes a radio module, but the information of that end product doesn't match the information from the radio module, then none of it's going to make sense. not understanding the basics. So we've covered some really fundamental, basic, simple stuff in this webinar today. Nothing here today has been complicated or groundbreaking, but these are the things that people get wrong. Not testing, so installing a module and just thinking, okay, I'll install it, and now I don't need to do anything. Poor instructions from the module manufacturer. This leads to the installer not realizing that they need to test and not realizing that their own Part 15B emissions testing, for example, would be changed. I think a lot of times module manufacturers don't want to give that level of detail because it looks like they're giving bad news. Lack of communication between the manufacturer, the test lab, the TCB, and the module manufacturer and the installer. Wrong company, wrong role. So again, this is manufacturers or installers often don't really want to take responsibility for which tests they must do. They go to the test lab and say, you tell me which tests you think we should do. Now, actually, the test lab is in a good position to give advice because the test lab will have attended training just like this, and they will employ people like me who know the requirements. But ultimately, it's not the test lab's decision. As I said, there's no definitive list of tests when installing a radio module. So the lab should advise the manufacturer, but it's the manufacturer's decision or the installer's decision. Thinking it's really simple, just buy a module and chuck it in, whereas in reality, you often find yourselves looking through radio module test reports. And of course, there's lots of misinformation on this topic. Lots of people will tell you that you don't need to test when installing a module, or that you definitely only have to test one channel and one emissions mode. Okay, so a quick reminder then about the webinar series. This is number 2. We've got a couple of weeks now until the next one, Radio Equipment Directive and UKCA requirements on the 8th of July. So thank you very much for attending. It's been enjoyable to speak to you. My name's Michael. And now let's see if we've got any questions. I will pass over to Laura in a moment. Here are my contact details. Thank you very much. Hey.
Hi, Michael.
Laura.
Thanks very much for the great presentation there. As you mentioned earlier, if you do have any questions at all, please submit those on the GoToWebinar panel to the right-hand side of your screen. But now I'll hand back over to Michael to answer some of those questions.
Yeah, no problem at all. So the first question is about installing a module into like a big piece of machinery, or a production line. And really, the concept is the same, whether you're installing a module into a massive production line or into a smaller device. The very simple concept is this. If you have the radio module, it's a certified radio, you don't have to install it in something. You can just use it as a radio, or you can install it in something else. Now, if the other thing, like a production line, isn't a certified product, then that production line or that thing you've installed it into may not have an authorization because maybe it doesn't have any processors, maybe it isn't a certified or DOC device, or even in the case of something as simple as a washing machine, it might not have its own authorization. But ultimately, if you can see the radio module and you can see the FCC ID and the ISED number of the module, then everything's fine. You installed it and you can see the module, so people can see it. If you can't see the module and you can't see the FCC ID, or there isn't a screen where the FCC ID and ISED number of the module is projected onto the screen, then there needs to be a label to state that that product contains the module. So really the logic, whether you're talking about a big set of machinery or a medium-sized product, if you can see the module and you can see the FCC ID, the label of the host only needs to state contains FCC ID and contains IC if you can't see the label of the module. If you can see the label of the module, then you don't need to state contains. FCC and ISED Canada both allow electronic labeling. So if you have it set such that the host's screen is able to display the FCC ID and ISED number of the module contained within it, then that's okay. But other than that, yeah, anything you put it into, the same logic applies. The certification exists, and you should check that you haven't created a monster with the installation, and therefore maybe some testing might be necessary. And then that comes to the next point, really, which is the consistent question is, well, which tests exactly must I do? And as I said in the presentation, there really isn't a definitive list. Now, a lot of my time has been spent on something which some of you might think, well, yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense. But others of you might think, well, I never even realized that was a possibility. I think one of the problems is a lot of people installing radio modules think that this is a very simple topic, because people do it all the time. People install radio modules into their products and place them on the market. Therefore, it's assumed to be very simple. But actually, from a testing and approvals process, it's about as complicated as it gets, because you're mixing electronic and radio products together in an unexpected or unknown way. So that, from a testing point of view, is very complicated. And from an approvals point of view, you're mixing multiple authorizations. And most importantly for the FCC and Canada, you're mixing legal responsibilities of different registered companies, which is a big issue. When we talk about Europe in the next two webinars, we'll realize that the installer takes full legal responsibility for everything. Whereas with the USA, you know, the module manufacturer has some legal responsibility still, and as does the installer. So one thing that I've spent a lot of my time doing is some manufacturers want to take a product to the lab and just say, look, I've installed modules, I need to get my product to market as quickly as possible, just test it. And just all the testing's done. But a lot of companies would say, right, I want you to, we've got our product, we've got one or two, or let's say 3 radio modules, quite a common thing. We've got this product, it's mobile, but it's got a carry strap, it's got LTE, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth in it. Each one of them is certified, but the host product needs some authorization. What exactly do I do? And you could go a very quick answer, like we could send them this video and say, test it, mate. Or, you know, a lot of my time has been spent going through all of the test reports of the LTE for all of the different modes, figuring out which channel gave the highest power, which channel, which modulation type, which bandwidth type gave the highest spurious emissions, the worst band edges, which LTE band is closest to the 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi and Bluetooth with regard to intermodulation products, which Wi-Fi channel gave the highest power or worst spurious emissions, how bad were the band edges. So really spending a lot of time going through the test reports of all of the radio modules and coming up with a detailed test plan of, right, if you start with this channel on the wireless LAN, this channel on the Bluetooth, or hopping on the Bluetooth, and this channel and this band of the LTE, and start off with this test, and if the results look good, I think you could stop there. That would be my recommendation. If you want to keep testing, you can. And here is how we would lay out your calculation for RF exposure, and here is the adjustments that need to be made to the modules approvals, and here is it. So it ends up being often like a 30 or 40 page report of really detailed instructions, and some people read those and go, brilliant, that's great. Other people read them and think, wow, I never knew it was that complicated. And that's part of the problem, is I think a lot of people don't realize that it's actually a complicated topic with a lot of pitfalls in it. So I think people assuming it's a very, very simple thing purely because it happens a lot. But actually it's pretty much about as complicated as it gets, really, installing radio modules. I've got some more questions coming. Can you just do SAR testing on portable end equipment with a mobile module fitted? Can they do SAR testing, or must they get the module manufacturer to do a change of use application? Right, so if the module is mobile and it goes into a portable host, as I mentioned on the slide, well, firstly, if the power of the module is low, you put it into a portable host and the power is low enough that a SAR test is not needed, then a SAR test is not needed. Then you need to look at the grant conditions of the module. If the module manufacturer was smart, then the grant would state for portable and mobile because the power was so low. And then you say, well, it's already certified for portable use. I've installed it. I'm using it portable. It still doesn't need a SAR test, so I'm good to go. But if we assume from this question that it's a higher power, like wireless LAN or LTE, and the grant of the module states mobile, and the module manufacturer owns and is responsible for that. So you install the module. You have to do a SAR test on the host product with the module in because the power is above the threshold. The grant of the module must be changed. If we assume, if the host product is a small portable wearable, like a phone or a small thing, then the whole thing will need a new certification, and you kind of have to forget that the module was ever certified. But if we assume it's a slightly bigger device, something that you would carry or could go in a backpack, then it's portable. You do a SAR test, so you check that the testing complies. That's the testing circle that says, right, I've tested it, it passes. But legally, the grant says it's only for use in mobile devices. So the module manufacturer must do a class 2 permissive change for the FCC, class 4 permissive change for ISED, to update the certification of their module to allow it to be used portable in your host. It won't be generically portable, it will be portable in your host based on your SAR reports. And the two options are, the module manufacturer does that permissive change process, or the module manufacturer authorizes you to do a change in ID and multiple listing and put your FCC ID and your ISED number on the module, and then you would do your own class 2 permissive change and class 4 permissive change on the module that you are now legally responsible for. But you can't just say, well, it passes the test. The grant says mobile, but it passes the SAR test, so I'll go ahead. That's confusing testing and authorization, whereas testing and authorization are separate. The SAR test is checking it passes, and the authorization is catching up with all the legal part. So yeah, you do need to do that stage. Okay, how should the module integrator document their approach and decisions relative to the module evaluation in and test in the host? That's a very good question. If you've changed something that's outside of the scope of the module, like if you've installed it and you've changed the antenna type, or if it's a solder down module and you've changed the antenna path, or you've gone from mobile to portable, those are all things that kind of break the grant condition of the module. And in those cases, the module manufacturer has to do that class 2 permissive change or class 4 permissive change for ISED, just as per the last question. But if you've bought a module, let's say it's mobile, and you've installed it into a mobile device, you've used the antenna that's on board the module, or you've perfectly replicated the antenna trace layout. So you haven't broken the RF exposure conditions, you haven't changed the antenna conditions, maybe you've installed another mobile module, or maybe you haven't. And if you have, maybe you've added the two powers together and you've proved that they are still under the power limit of the FCC, and the combined RF exposure is still safe, and you've done some spurious emissions testing to satisfy yourself, maybe based on one thing I didn't mention before when I talked about these big reports that I write is, how is it installed in the product? That might affect the installer's decision. Is it buried down deep inside with cables all over it, or is it sitting on top next to a plastic enclosure? All those things you would take into consideration, and you would just document them for yourself and keep those on record so that you are selling an authorized device. So when we look at our testing and authorization, you have test results that demonstrate to yourself that your end product is compliant. The authorization of the module remains valid because you didn't break any of those conditions. The authorization of your host is valid because you did your Part 15B emissions. The transmitter spurious emissions checks, you did those, however much of those you wanted to do. Maybe you checked the EIRP, maybe you checked all of your transmitter spurious emissions, maybe you only checked a little bit. Maybe you checked the first 3 harmonics or 5th harmonic and then thought, I'm seeing nothing. I'm not going to test all the way up to the 10th harmonic. All of those decisions you made, you keep those on your own records, document them, kind of like a USA equivalent to a technical documentation file. Keep them somewhere handy so that if there's ever any problem with your product, you can say, look, I checked it, I did these tests. But you don't need to update the grant of the module because you haven't changed the conditions of them. And you don't need to send them to a TCB because they're not for certification. Okay, well, that's it actually. That's all we've got for questions. So either I answered all the questions in the presentation, or everybody's speechless. Who knows? Or just too hot. Maybe they're all at the beach, Laura.
I think you just obviously did a perfect job there, Michael. So you've clearly covered everything in the presentation there. So well done. Thanks very much for going through these questions and doing the presentation as well. And thanks everybody for attending. As Michael mentioned, we will be hosting the third part in our 4-part series. That's going to be on Thursday, the 8th of July. So in a couple of weeks' time, at the same time as the morning session and the afternoon session. So it's going to be exactly the same time, but on July the 8th. So what we will do is we'll send everybody a recording of the presentation, and in that email we'll send a link to the next webinar in the series as well. So you've got the opportunity to register for the next for the third part in our 4-part series, if you haven't done so already. And we will be actually there will be a short survey that will appear on your screen shortly. So if you can take the time to obviously give us your feedback, that would be fantastic, as it's going to help us improve our future webinars. Thanks again, Michael. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.